be with you like a forever chemical. I wanna be with you like a forever chemical.
Dr. Craig Butt here from SciX, and welcome to another episode of Dr. Craig's PFAS Fireside Chats. When PFAS-containing firefighting foams, or 𝗩𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁, are sprayed, they often come into contact and soak into the nearby soils. And once in those soils, they can eventually move around, impacting deeper groundwater or surface water such as lakes and rivers. Earlier scientific studies investigated the fate of these so-called legacy PFAS, such as PFAS and PFOA, in soils. But we now know that firefighting foams are actually much more complex and contain many PFAS structures of varying physical and chemical properties. So how do these PFAS behave in soils? And how do they impact on the PFAS life cycle? Well, my next guest and his co-authors addressed those questions in a recent paper. Professor Chris Higgins from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Colorado School of Mines is here to talk with me about those findings. Chris, welcome to PFAS Fireside Chats.
Great. Thanks for having me here, Craig.
Great. So in your study, you took two soils that had been impacted by 𝗩𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗏. You brought them back to the lab, passed water through them, and measured basically how quickly the different PFAS leached off. So considering the broader classes of PFAS, kind of very high level, what did you find? I mean, did you find that they all behaved the same, or were they different?
There were some pretty big differences. So, of course, there's a lot of interest in what I would call the traditional compounds, such as the carboxylates, PFOA being the best example, and the sulfonates, PFOS, being a big example. But, you know, we know, as you said in your introduction, we know that these foams are much more complex. There's a lot of different compounds there. And we wanted to understand how they all were coming off, and were there similarities and differences. And there were huge differences, particularly for the compounds that have a much more complex head group. So they still have the perfluoroalkyl tail, but they have this very kind of often complicated, sometimes cationic, sometimes viterionic, so positively or at least positively and negatively charged head group. And we expected that some of these compounds would take a lot longer to come off the soil, and this study really kind of showed that they do. You know, some of the compounds come off quickly, some take a really, really long time to come off.
Okay. All right. So the ones that come off quickly, let's kind of start at the earlier part. So which kind of compounds are coming off very quickly from your soils?
So it's probably not a surprise to anyone who's looked at some of these different types of compounds. It's really the shorter chain compounds, the shorter chain carboxylates, some of the shorter chain sulfonates tend to come off pretty quickly from these soils. And we see a very clear progression. The longer the chemical, the longer it takes to come off. So it's really the short ones that come off the most quickly, I would say.
Okay. And then you mentioned the legacy ones, the carboxylic acids like PFOA, sulfonic acids, right? Those are in that same group that are coming off really quickly.
They are, but again, because it's a chain length dependent behavior, the longer they are, they do take a little bit longer to come off. So, for example, PFOS still took a fair amount to reach its maximum concentration coming off the soil.
Okay. Another finding that you saw, which I thought was really interesting, was that in general, the kind of terminal products, like the carboxylic acids and sulfonates, they came off really quickly, and ones that were sticking around longer tended to be suspected or known precursors to those, right? So to me, that's very interesting, and we think about the ability of a soil to act as a reservoir for PFAS. So maybe if you could just spend a few moments kind of talking about that, and what does this mean in terms of long-term risk for PFAS in soils and the surrounding environment?
Yeah, so it really kind of gets at the heart of why we started in on this project, which is that we know that PFAS are an issue for groundwater. We see very large plumes of these compounds, sometimes miles or kilometers long, and pretty, in some cases, very significant concentrations. And yet, when people go and look at soils, particularly where these foams have been applied, you see astronomical concentrations often. And so, if these compounds are so mobile, why are we still seeing them in the soil? And there's two kind of, I like to think of it as kind of two prevailing and not necessarily mutually exclusive ideas as to why they might be sitting in the soils. One is these are air-water interface surfactants, and in the shallow soils, you tend to see a lot of air-water interfaces, and so they can stick to that. And there's other research, not work in this paper we're talking about, but other work to show that that can be a retention mechanism that can lead to them staying around in soils. But the other reason they can still be present in soils is that if you have these precursors, and as you said, these precursors stick around a lot longer in these soils. That was a pretty big finding here. And I will say that wasn't totally unexpected. But it hadn't been shown, and so we were really happy to be able to actually observe that. If they're present in the soil, they have the potential to slowly, over time, be released and be transformed. And the transformation, again, we didn't handle that. There's a lot of work looking at that, and the kinetics of transformation is very complex. But we certainly observe the fact that they can be retained and slowly leached out of the soil. And then if they are transformed in the groundwater or down gradient, that would lead to a continuous source of these compounds to groundwater.
Yeah. Yeah, no, really interesting, because I think that research really helps to address how our perception of PFAS in soils and the ability to act as a reservoir, continued source for many years to come. So, I kind of want to get back a little bit to the differences that you saw amongst the classes. What does that say in terms of the mechanisms that the PFAS are, sticking to the soils or being released from the soils?
It says that when you look at a PFAS structure and you're trying to say, this compound will behave in a certain way, you have to look at the two very distinct components of the molecule. One is the very obvious one that a lot of us have been studying for many years, which is the length of the perfluoroalkyl tail, short chain, long chain, right? Mm-hmm. But the head group, particularly in these firefighting foams, can be a major contributor. And we certainly saw things that had a positive charge, which you would expect to interact very strongly with soils, most of which are negatively charged. Some of those, even though we had run up to like 200 pore volumes of water through these soils, they were only really starting to come off at that point for some of those structures. Okay. But even within those compounds, if you looked at the shorter chain versus the longer chain version, you still saw differences. Mm-hmm. So it's really a combination of the chain length, which would indicate, hydrophobic type interactions that might be engaging between the chemical and the soil, but also potential charge type interactions with the head group on the soil particles.
Okay. No, that's interesting. And so you had also mentioned about one group of chemicals took a very long time to be released from the soil. I think you mentioned 200 pore volumes.
Yeah, I'd have to look more specifically at that, exactly when that peak arrived, but there were some that we realized when we ended the experiment that it was still going up.
Yeah.
So we could have gone longer.
Is it possible to extrapolate that into what we'd expect to see in a real life environment? How many years would that equate to? A lot of variables there I'm sure in terms of rainfall and.
Yeah, and to be clear, we were looking at just saturated conditions, so not even worrying about the air-water interfacial kind of components there. But we didn't in this study try to extrapolate. I have certainly talked and heard of others who have also tried to extrapolate, not even accounting for some of these chemicals that we're talking about. And we're talking certainly decadal, if not, multiple decades. I've even heard people throughout, 250 years-ish for real significant depletion of the soils, given how slow some of these compounds might move through.
Wow. Yeah. So the problem's going to be with us for a long time, clearly.
Yes.
Now, again, sort of getting back into the chemicals you studied, right? So, the traditional compounds, the PFAS and PFOA, been studied for a long time, but these newer ones, and certainly I would say more AFFF type of chemicals are being discovered and characterized every year. You used high-res mass spec, right? And so maybe if you could, provide a little bit of background as to why you did and really what kind of additional information you were able to get from using that technique.
Yeah, so to be super clear, the chemicals that we're observing in these soils are not new, they're just newly known. They've been around for a while. And I think that's an important distinction in that, these chemicals were synthesized decades ago and released in the environment. What high resolution really helped us with is the fact that we had characterized foam before, and there's still, as you said, there's new work coming out all the time, identifying new compounds in foam that has been used because that information has not been publicly disclosed. And as those papers come out, you could create a long list of compounds to go and look for. But it's a very long list of compounds that might be present. And so you could go and do this with a targeted mass spec method and say, let's look for all of them. But it would not be the most efficient way to do it. And it also doesn't allow you to look for transformation products. So there are compounds that we observe actually that are fairly abundant in the soil or in the groundwater, which are not major components of the foam. And so using high resolution mass spec where we're looking for everything that we can at the same time in both positive and negative mode. I'll mention that. That's a really important thing to keep in mind is that many people focus on PFAS analysis only by electrospray negative mode ionization. And particularly at these foam impacted sites, you're missing a lot of stuff if you only look in negative electrospray. But when you look in negative and positive electrospray high res, you can see all of these different compounds that are there. And even if you can't quantify them because we don't have standards yet, you can get a sense of their potential relative importance and how they're behaving.
Yeah.
And that's the approach we took with the study.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And some good points there too, right? Because you mentioned about doing it in positive and negative. And certainly if you had stuck to a traditional monitoring list, like an EPA 533 or a DOD list, then you'd be missing a whole lot of, that kind of PFAS dark matter that's in the soils and the runoff.
Yeah, and I'll throw out a specific example. One of the things in this study that was really, I think, important and ties in with a lot of what we're seeing at other sites is the sulfonamides. So many folks have looked at FOSA, F-O-S-A, sometimes referred to as PFOSA, for many years, but there's other chain length versions of that. And when we looked at the C6, when we looked at the C6 versions of the chemicals in the soil, the C6 sulfonamide was really important. It was a very, very large fraction of the mass of C6 present in the soils.
Huh. That's interesting, because one of my other guests, 𝗩𝗶𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗀, who was looking at PFAS and the beluga whales from the St. Lawrence River estuary, also showed that a lot of her novel compounds were sulfonamides. So, interesting story there.
I think there's going to be a lot more to tell about sulfonamides in the near future.
Fantastic. Sounds like there's another story there with the sulfonamides, and when you do publish that work, then we'll have you on the show and talk about it some more. But yeah, really interesting study. I think, in terms of expanding our knowledge of how PFAS behave in the soil, particularly these relatively, I would say, poorly understood chemicals, even though they've been around for a long time, as you noted. improving our understanding of their fate and how behavior in soils contributes to the PFAS life cycle. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Craig.
Wanna be with you like a forever chemical.